The dust of redemption settled in a fine red film on everything, on the warped planks of the boardwalk, on the sweat-slicked brims of hats, on the silent hopes of men who came west to escape a past that always found them. Jack Thorne felt it in his throat, a gritty reminder of the life he'd chosen, or the one that had chosen him. He stood in the cool, tomb-like quiet of the Redemption Bank and Trust, and the weight of a single silver dollar in his hand, less heavy than the weight of the memory in his pocket. The bank smelled of old paper and oiled steel. Mr. Abernathy, the teller, a man whose spine had been permanently bent by years of counting other people's fortunes, peered at Jack over his spectacles. "Just the supplies, Mr. Thorne," he asked, his voice thin as a whisper. Jack nodded, his words rare and hoarded like water in a drought. "Flour, salt, coffee." He didn't need to say more. His list was the same every month, a litany of survival. As Abernathy turned to his ledger, Jack's thumb found the familiar smooth coolness of the silver locket in his waistcoat pocket. He didn't need to open it to see the face inside Sarah, her smile as faint and precious as a prairie rose in a dry year. It was all he had left of her. The photograph, tiny and fading, was his anchor in a world that had long ago drifted away. The bell above the door didn't jingle. It slammed. 3 men burst in their faces, hidden by dusty bandanas. The air cracked with the flat, deafening report of a pistol fired into the ceiling. Plaster dust rained down like unholy snow. Chaos erupted. A woman screamed a high, thin sound that was quickly choked off. Mr. Abernathy threw his hands up, his face the color of bleached parchment. On the floor, now one of the outlaws roared, his voice a gravelly command that brooked no argument. Jack didn't move. He wasn't a hero, not anymore. The part of him that might have been had been buried on a windswept hill years ago. But he watched, his eyes narrowed, cataloging details with the grim patience of a predator. The leader was tall, his movements fluid and confident. The other 2 were nervous, their guns wavering. Amateurs flanking a professional. The leader vaulted the counter with practiced ease, shoving Abernathy against the wall. The safe opened. As his men herded the terrified customers into a corner, then the leader's gaze swept the room and landed on Jack, the one man still standing. His eyes, visible above the bandana, were a startlingly pale, cold blue. They held a flicker of something more than greed, a flicker of cruel amusement. "You deaf old man," the outlaw sneered, leveling his pistol at Jack's chest. "I said get on the floor." Jack slowly lowered himself to one knee, his hands raised but not too high. He kept his eyes on the man, his mind a cold, calculating machine. The floorboards were rough beneath his worn boots. He could feel the faint vibration as the other men began stuffing canvas bags with cash. The robbery was swift, brutal, and efficient. It was almost over. Then the leader's pale eyes caught the glint of the silver chain disappearing into Jack's pocket. He strode forward, the spurs on his boots ringing with chilling finality on the wooden floor. "What's this?" he murmured, his voice a low purr. He hooked a finger around the chain and ripped it free. The locket swung in the air between them, a tiny silver pendulum marking the seconds of Jack's world coming undone. Something inside Jack snapped. A dormant volcanic rage erupted through the years of self-imposed silence. He moved without thinking, a blur of motion born of pure primal instinct. He lunged not for the gun, but for the locket. His big calloused hand closed around the outlaw's wrist. The man was surprised by his speed, by his strength. For a heartbeat, they were locked in a silent struggle, a contest of wills over a small silver object that held the entire universe of a dead woman's smile. "Let go," Jack growled, his voice a low rumble of thunder. The leader's lips twisted into a smirk behind his mask. "It's pretty," he said. And then he drove the barrel of his pistol hard into Jack's temple. Light exploded behind Jack's eyes, a blinding white flash, followed by a wave of nauseating darkness. He staggered back, the world tilting on its axis. The outlaw wrenched the locket free from his weakening grasp. "A keepsake," the leader mused, turning it over in his palm. He didn't even bother to open it. He simply shoved it into his own pocket as if it were a common stone. Payment for your trouble. He gestured to his men. We're done here. As they backed out of the door, guns still trained on the trembling customers, the leader paused and looked back at Jack, who was struggling to stay conscious on the floor. Remember this day, rancher, he said, and the cold amusement in his eyes had been replaced by something that looked chillingly like satisfaction. Some debts take a long time to collect. Then they were gone, their hoofbeats fading into the indifferent noise of the town. Jack pushed himself up his head, throbbing a trickle of blood tracing a warm path down his temple. He ignored the concerned gasps of the other customers, ignored Mr. Abernathy's frantic questions. His eyes were fixed on the empty doorway, on the swirling dust motes where the men had stood. They hadn't just stolen money. They had stolen his wife. They had stolen his past, the one thing he had left to protect. The silence in the bank was heavier now, filled with a new and terrible emptiness. The dust settled, and in the heart of that stillness, a cold, hard purpose began to form, solidifying from the ruins of his grief. He would find them. He would get it back. It was no longer a choice. It was the only thing left. The trail back to his ranch was a lonely scar across the vast, indifferent face of the prairie. The sun beat down a merciless hammer against the anvil of the earth, turning the endless expanse of red sand to glowing embers. Jack rode without feeling the heat and the throb in his head, a dull echo of the roaring void that had opened in his chest. His ranch was less a home than a monument to solitude, a clapboard house and a sturdy barn huddled together against the overwhelming emptiness, bleached bone-white by the sun and scoured by the wind. For 5 years this silence had been his penance. Now it was just empty. Inside the cabin was stark and clean. A rough-hewn table, a single chair, a stone hearth swept clean of ash. A bed with a neatly folded quilt. It was the space of a man who expected nothing and wanted less. He slumped into the chair, the wood groaning under his weight. His gaze fell upon the small, unadorned wooden box on the mantel. It held Sarah's only other possessions, a pressed wildflower from their wedding day, and a handful of letters he could no longer bring himself to read. The locket had been the living part of that memory, the part he could carry with him. Without it, the box was just a coffin. Days bled into one another, marked only by the rising and setting of a sun he barely noticed. He tended his cattle, fixed his fences, his movements mechanical, his mind miles away, tracing the hoofprints of ghosts. The rage from the bank had cooled into a hard, dense resolve, cold and heavy as a stone in his gut. He was planning gathering the few things he would need. He would ride out at the end of the week. He would not come back without it. The storm came on the 5th night, appearing from nowhere like a divine judgment. The sky turned a bruised purple-gray, and the wind began to howl, a low, mournful sound that seemed to carry the sorrow of the entire prairie. Rain came not in drops, but in solid, wind-whipped sheets that hammered against the roof and blurred the world into a churning chaos of water and darkness. Jack stood on the porch watching the storm, feeling a strange kinship with its senseless fury. It was then that he heard it, a sound almost lost in the gale, a sharp, frantic beating. It wasn't the wind. It was a fist against his door. He unlatched the heavy plank door, his pistol instinctively in his hand. The wind tore it open, slamming it back against the wall. Cold and rain surged in, and with them 2 small bedraggled figures, no more substantial than shadows. 2 little girls, thin as saplings, their dresses torn and soaked through their faces, pale with terror and exhaustion. The older one, maybe 8, held the younger, who couldn't be more than 5, with a fierce protective grip. They stared up at him, their eyes wide and dark in the flickering lamplight. For a long, silent moment, he just stood there, a giant of a man, silhouetted in the doorway, the storm raging behind him. He was a wall, and they had just run from a world of walls. The older girl's voice was a splintered whisper, barely audible over the wind. She shut the door. She shivered, her teeth chattering. said we wasn't her blood. Jack's brow furrowed. He understood the cruelty of closed doors. He understood the sting of being told you didn't belong. The rage in his chest, the one he'd been nursing for 5 days, shifted, making way for something older. Something he thought long buried. He stepped aside. "Come in," his voice was low, rough from disuse, but it was a command of sanctuary, not authority. They stumbled past him, collapsing near the hearth where embers glowed weakly. He shut the door, the solid thud sealing out the storm. The world was reduced to this one small, warm room. He stoked the fire, coaxing flames from the coals, and the warmth began to creep back into their small, trembling bodies. He studied them as he set a kettle on the stove. Their hair was a tangled mess of mud and rain, their shoes mismatched and worn through. They carried nothing. They had nothing but each other. The younger one peered up at him, her lips cracked and blue. "We're hungry," she whispered. Jack turned to the cupboard. He had planned no supper beyond what a man alone needed, but he measured out flour and beans with steady hands, his movements sure and practiced, despite the storm raging both outside and in. The smell of broth and baking bread soon filled the small cabin, a scent of life, in a house that had long smelled only of dust and solitude. He set the bowls before them, and they ate with a desperate, silent intensity. He watched them, his own plans, the hunt, the revenge, receding like a distant shoreline. A memory surfaced unbidden, a grave on a hill, a door shutting behind him 5 years ago, leaving him alone with his silence. He had not thought himself capable of anything more than enduring. When they had finished, the older girl, Lily, spoke again, her voice stronger now. "She said we was nothing to her. Said Pa's gone, so we're nothing." Jack leaned forward, his elbows heavy on the table. He looked at her, then at the younger one, Rose, whose head was already drooping with exhaustion. He searched for words, the unfamiliar tools clumsy in his mind. "Blood don't make a heartbeat warmer," he said finally, the words a low rumble. "You're safe here." Rose's head drooped onto her sister's shoulder, sleep taking her mercifully. Lily fought to keep her eyes open, as if afraid to let this fragile safety disappear. But she too eventually succumbed, curling up on the rug by the fire. Jack rose and pulled the heavy quilt from his bed, draping it over their small forms. He stood over them for a long moment, his jaw tight. Something in his chest, a tectonic plate of grief and resolve, shifted painfully. He had not asked for them. He had been preparing for a journey of vengeance. Now 2 small breathing reasons to stay were asleep on his floor. He turned back to the fire, adding another log. The kettle whistled softly. Outside, the prairie groaned under the storm's weight. By morning, the rain would have washed away their tracks. There would be no sign of where they had come from, only that their small, desperate fists had knocked on his door, and he had answered. He looked at the door, once a barrier against the world, now a shield against the storm. His plans for redemption for the locket were still there, a cold, hard knot in his gut. But they were no longer simple. He couldn't just ride away. The storm had brought him more than 2 orphans. It had brought him a complication. It had brought him a choice. A few weeks later, when the mud had dried and the prairie had exploded into a riot of green, a new shadow fell over redemption. It arrived in a polished black carriage drawn by 2 perfectly matched geldings, a stark contrast to the dusty, sweat-stained horses of the locals. A man stepped out, dressed in a tailored Eastern suit, his boots polished to a mirror shine. He moved with an easy, confident grace that immediately set him apart. His name, the town soon learned, was Silas Blackwood. He was handsome in a severe way, with sharp, intelligent features and the same pale, cold blue eyes that haunted Jack's waking moments. He was charismatic, his words smooth as silk, and he carried with him the undeniable authority of wealth. He bought drinks for the men in the saloon and tipped his hat to the ladies, his smile both charming and unnervingly predatory. He said he was a land investor looking for opportunities, His first order of business was to file a legal claim at the magistrate's office on an abandoned plot of land just east of Jack's ranch, the very property where Lily and Rose's father had lived and died. The claim was airtight, backed by deeds and paperwork that the local magistrate couldn't argue with. It was the girl's former home. Silas paid Jack a visit one blistering afternoon. He rode up to the ranch, not on a working horse, but on a fine black stallion that seemed to radiate arrogance. Lily and Rose, who had been playing near the porch, scurried behind Jack as he stepped out to meet the man. Mr. Thorne Silas began his smile, not reaching his eyes. Silas Blackwood. I believe we are to be neighbors. Jack said nothing, his hand resting on the porch post. He watched Silas, a cold feeling coiling in his stomach. He knew those eyes. He had felt the impact of the pistol they had guided. This was the man from the bank. The leader. I've acquired the old Miller place. Silas continued gesturing with a gloved hand. A bit run down, but it has potential. As does your land. He let his gaze drift over Jack's property, a flicker of appraisal in his expression. I'm prepared to make you a generous offer for it. More than generous, in fact. Enough to set you up comfortably somewhere else. A man like you with new responsibilities. He glanced meaningfully at the two girls hiding behind Jack's legs. It's not for sale, Jack said, his voice flat and final. Silas's smile tightened. Everything is for sale, Mr. Thorne, for the right price. Perhaps you haven't heard it yet. He leaned forward in his saddle, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. A lone man taking in two orphan girls. People talk, they wonder. It's an unstable situation. Unseemly, some might say. Selling to me would solve a great many problems. For everyone. The veiled threat hung in the air, thick and suffocating as the summer heat. I said. Jack repeated, his voice dangerously low. It's not for sale. Silas's charm evaporated, revealing the cold steel beneath. A pity, he said, pulling his horse's reins. I find I usually get what I want. Sooner or later. He tipped his hat in a mockery of politeness and rode away, leaving Jack with the bitter taste of dust and dread. The pressure started subtly. In town, Silas's money began to talk. He invested in the mercantile, offering credit where there had been none. He paid for a new roof for the church. He was a benefactor, a savior. And with his generosity came his influence. Whispers about Jack, once idle gossip, now took on a sharper, more malicious edge, fueled by Silas's sly comments and insinuations. A troubled man, he'd say, over a glass of whiskey at the saloon. And those poor girls. One has to worry. Then came the hired thugs. Rough men with dead eyes began appearing in Redemption, all on Silas Blackwood's payroll. They started small. A section of Jack's fence was cut in the middle of the night, scattering his cattle. The rope for his well was sliced, forcing him to spend a day repairing it. These were annoyances designed to wear him down. Jack found the cut fence line at dawn. As he worked to mend it, his hands moving with grim efficiency, Lily came out with a cup of water. She stood beside him, her small face a mask of worry. It was him, wasn't it? She asked, her voice quiet. Jack drove a post into the hard earth with a single powerful blow. Yes. Why does he hate us? Rose asked from the porch, clutching a small wooden bird Jack had carved for her. Jack paused, leaning on the post driver. He looked at their anxious faces, and the cold purpose he'd felt after the robbery was now forged in the fire of pure protective instinct. This wasn't just about a locket anymore. This was about them. About this small, fragile world he had accidentally built. He doesn't hate you. Jack said, his voice softer than he intended. He wants something, and we're in his way. The intimidation escalated. One evening, as Jack rode back from checking his herd, two of Silas's men blocked the trail. They didn't draw their guns, but their presence was a clear threat. Mr. Blackwood wants you to reconsider his offer, one of them said, a hulking man with a scarred face. It would be healthier for you. Jack sat motionless on his horse, his hand resting near the butt of his holstered Colt. His gaze was cold and steady. "Tell Mr. Blackwood," he said, his voice calm, "that I don't like being crowded." He urged his horse forward right between them. For a tense moment, no one moved. Then the men grudgingly parted their eyes, full of hate. Jack didn't look back as he rode on, but he could feel their stares burning into him. He knew he couldn't protect the girls and his home by just being defensive. Silas was a snake, and you couldn't just wait for a snake to bite. You had to go after its head. The hunt he had planned to start weeks ago was back on, but the target was no longer a nameless thief. He had a name, a face, and he was right here. Jack started his own quiet investigation. He rode into Redemption not just for supplies, but to listen. He spent his silver dollar on a whiskey at the saloon, sitting in a dark corner, nursing the drink and absorbing the conversations around him. He learned that Silas's men were the same kind of roughnecks who drifted from one dirty job to the next. He learned that Silas received letters by stagecoach from back east, and that his wealth seemed limitless. He sought out the town sheriff, a man named Elias Vance. Vance was a world-weary lawman, his face a roadmap of past fights and lost causes, but he was honorable. Jack found him in his office, cleaning his rifle. "Silas Blackwood," Jack said, getting straight to the point. "His men cut my fence." Vance sighed, not looking up from his work. "You got proof they were his men." "I know it. You know it. Knowing and proving are two different roads, Thorne. And Blackwood's road is paved with gold. He's got half the town council in his pocket. I can't touch him without a solid reason." "There was a bank robbery a few weeks back," Jack said, watching the sheriff carefully. The leader had pale blue eyes. He was tall, moved, like he knew what he was doing. Vance finally stopped cleaning his rifle and met Jack's gaze. "A lot of men have blue eyes, not like his," Jack said. "And he stole something from me. A silver locket." The sheriff was silent for a moment. "I'll keep my eyes open." He said a non-committal promise that was the most Jack could hope for. The bond with the girls deepened with every passing day, forging a family not of blood, but of shared adversity. He taught Lily how to read from an old tattered Bible, her small finger tracing the words as he sounded them out. He taught Rose the names of the constellations, pointing them out in the vast star-dusted canopy of the night sky. They, in turn, chipped away at the walls he had built around his heart. They left wildflowers on his table. They ran to greet him when he came back from the fields. Their laughter began to fill the quiet spaces of the cabin, a sound he had never expected to hear again. One afternoon, a breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Jack was in town buying nails at the Mercantile when he saw Silas Blackwood step out of the assayer's office. Silas paused on the boardwalk, pulling a handkerchief from his pocket to wipe his brow. As he did, something else came with it, a small silver object that fell to the dusty planks with a soft clink. It was a locket. Silas quickly bent to retrieve it, but not before Jack saw it clearly. It was ornate, identical in design to Sarah's. Silas pocketed it and glanced up, his eyes meeting Jack's across the street. A flash of something annoyance, perhaps even fear, crossed Silas's face before he masked it with his usual arrogant smile. He gave Jack a curt nod and walked away. Jack's blood ran cold. It couldn't be Sarah's locket. The one stolen from him was plain, unadorned. This was different, but the same. A matching piece. What were the chances of that? It was more than a coincidence. It was a clue, a thread connecting Silas to something deeper, something personal. That evening, as he sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple, Lily came and sat beside him. "You're worried," she said. It wasn't a question. "Just thinking," he replied. "About him?" Jack nodded. He looked at her, at the quiet strength in her young face. He had been trying to shield them from this, but she was too smart, too perceptive. She deserved some measure of the truth. "He's not just after the land, Lily," he said, his voice low. I think he's after me." She placed her small hand on his arm, her touch surprisingly steady. "Then we'll face him together," she said, her voice filled with a conviction that humbled him. "You're our pa now. We protect our own." The word pa still sent a jolt through him, a mixture of terror and profound, aching warmth. He was their protector, but they were also his. His reason. His fight. The next day, Jack cornered one of Silas's thugs in the alley behind the saloon. The man was drunk, stumbling out into the midday sun. Jack moved with the swift, silent grace of a mountain cat, pressing the man against the rough brick wall before he could even react. "I want to know about Blackwood," Jack growled, his face inches from the man's. The man sneered, his breath sour with cheap whiskey. "Blackwood don't like people asking questions. And I don't like men who cut my fences," Jack retorted, his grip tightening. "The bank robbery and redemption. He was there, wasn't he?" Fear flickered in the man's eyes. "I don't know what you're talking about." "I think you do." Jack pressed harder. "Why is he here? It's not about the land." The man squirmed, his drunken bravado fading. He licked his dry lips. "You don't get it, do you?" he hissed. "This ain't about dirt and water rights. This is about blood. It's about a debt to be paid for a life taken." He started to laugh, a ragged, ugly sound. "He's gonna ruin you, Thorne, piece by piece. He told us, said it was only fair." Jack released him, shoving him away. The man stumbled and fled down the alley. A debt for a life taken. The words echoed in Jack's mind, unlocking a door to a part of his past he kept bolted shut. The gunfight, the stray bullet, the day he lost everything. It had happened years ago in a different town, but the memory was as fresh as an open wound. He had killed a man, a young reckless fool who had drawn on him in a dispute over cards. It was a fair fight, the law had said. Self-defense. But a bullet from the fool's gun had gone wide, and Sarah had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Could Silas be connected to that man? Was this entire, elaborate scheme, the land grab and the intimidation, the robbery of the locket, all a twisted, long-simmering vendetta? The conflict had shifted once more. It wasn't a fight for property, or even for the locket. It was a fight for his life, born from a ghost he thought he had outrun. He had come west to bury his past, but the past had dug itself up and come looking for him. Silas Blackwood, realizing that his careful facade was crumbling, decided to abandon all pretense. The time for subtle pressure and veiled threats was over. He knew Jack was closing in on the truth, and like a cornered animal, he chose to strike hard and decisively. It happened on a day when the sky was a sheet of pale, hazy brass, and the air was still with the promise of violence. Jack had ridden out to the far edge of his property to check on a water pump, leaving Lily and Rose at the cabin, with strict instructions not to open the door to anyone. It was a risk leaving them alone, but the pump was essential, and he hadn't expected Silas to move so quickly, so brazenly. When he returned, the late afternoon sun, casting long, distorted shadows across the yard, an unnatural quiet greeted him. The usual sound of the girls' chatter was absent. The front door of the cabin hung slightly ajar, a silent, ominous invitation. A cold dread, sharper and more potent than any fear he had ever known, seized him. He dismounted before his horse had even stopped, his hand already on his colt, and moved toward the cabin. "Lily, Rose," he called out, his voice tight. Only silence answered. Inside, a chair was overturned. A tin cup lay on the floor, a small puddle of milk soaking into the wood. On the rough-hewn table where they did their reading lessons lay a single folded piece of paper held down by Rose's wooden bird. His hands trembled slightly as he picked it up. The handwriting was elegant, precise, and utterly mocking. "Thorne, you have something that belongs to me, a past I intend to settle. And now I have something that belongs to you. If you want to see the girls again, come to the abandoned Monarch mine at sunset. Come alone. It's time to pay your debt." See ye. The world narrowed to the words on that paper. The air in his lungs turned to ice. He could feel their terror, imagine their tears. Silas had them. He had taken the only thing that mattered, the one piece of his life that had brought light back into the darkness. The rage that filled him was no longer hot. It was a glacier, immense, cold, and unstoppable. He didn't hesitate. He checked his pistol, ensuring every chamber was loaded. He grabbed a rifle from the rack by the door and a box of cartridges. He strode out of the cabin, leaving the door gaping open behind him, and swung himself onto his horse. The Monarch mine was a gaping wound in the side of the mesas to the north, a place whispered about by the townsfolk, said to be haunted by the ghosts of miners who had died in a collapse years ago. It was a treacherous, unstable place, the perfect stage for a final showdown. As he rode, the sky began to change. The hazy brass yellowed to a sickly ochre, and the wind began to pick up, carrying with it the fine, stinging grit of the desert. A sandstorm was coming. The horizon was a blurry, churning wall of dust, a monstrous thing that would soon swallow the world. It was a race against Silas and a race against the storm. He pushed his horse harder, the animal's breath coming in ragged bursts. The wind howled in his ears, and the sand began to bite at his exposed skin. The sun, a dim, bloody orb, was sinking behind the advancing wall of dust. He reached the mine, just as the first tendrils of the storm struck a full gale blast that threatened to tear him from the saddle. The entrance to the mine was a dark, jagged mouth in the rock face, framed by the skeletal remains of a wooden winch tower. He dismounted, tethering his horse to a withered scrub brush, and pulled his bandana up over his nose and mouth. With his rifle in hand, he stepped into the darkness. The air inside was cold and still smelling of damp earth and decay. A single lantern cast a flickering, inadequate pool of light deeper in the tunnel, revealing Silas Blackwood standing beside a rickety support beam. Lily and Rose were there, huddled together, their eyes wide with fear. They were tied loosely, more for show than for actual restraint. Thorn Silas said, his voice echoing in the confined space. "Punctual. I appreciate that." "Let them go, Blackwood Jack," said his voice, a low growl. His rifle was leveled at Silas's chest. Silas chuckled, a dry, mirthless sound. "All in due time. First, we have a family matter to discuss." He reached into his coat and pulled out the ornate silver locket, letting it swing from its chain. "You recognize the design, I imagine. This belonged to my mother. She gave one to each of her sons." He paused, letting the words sink in. "The man you killed in that card game. The reckless fool. That was my younger brother Daniel." The main twist landed with the force of a physical blow. The debt. A life for a life. It all snapped into place. The robbery wasn't random. The pressure on his land wasn't about greed. It was all personal. It had always been personal. "He drew on me," Jack said, his voice hoarse. "It was a fair fight." Fair? Silas's voice dripped with venom. "You call it fair that my brother lies in the ground while you get to walk away, while you get to build a new life, a new family?" He gestured angrily at the girls. "You took my family, Thorn. I'm simply returning the favor. I orchestrated everything. The bank robbery was just to get your attention, to take from you something you cared about, a small taste of what was to come." The wind shrieked at the mouth of the mine, and a river of sand began to pour in the storm, descending with its full fury. The lantern flickered wildly, threatening to plunge them into total darkness. "It wasn't just my brother you destroyed that day." Silas continued, his voice rising over the storm. "There's a part of the story you never knew. A secret I've held on to, waiting for this very moment." He took a step closer, his eyes burning with a mad, triumphant light. "Your wife, Sarah. The stray bullet. That's the story you told yourself. The story the town told you. But it's a lie." Jack froze, his finger tightening on the trigger. "What are you talking about?" "She didn't die in the crossfire," Silas sneered, delivering the secondary devastating twist. "The bullet only grazed her shoulder. She died 3 days later. She took her own life, Thorn. hung herself from the rafters of your barn because she couldn't live with the grief, couldn't live with the man she loved having blood on his hands. I made sure the truth was buried. I wanted you to live with the guilt of a tragic accident, not the agonizing truth of her despair. I wanted your pain to be a slow poison. The foundation of Jack's world crumbled into dust. The truth was a horror beyond anything he could have imagined. His grief, his penance, his entire solitary existence, it was all built on a lie. Sarah hadn't been taken from him by a stray bullet. She had left him. For a moment he was paralyzed by the agony of it. And in that moment, Silas moved. He didn't draw a gun. He kicked the lantern, plunging the mine shaft into absolute darkness. Simultaneously, the storm hit the entrance with the force of a locomotive. The unstable beams above them groaned, and dirt and pebbles rained down from the ceiling. Pa Lily's scream cut through the roaring darkness. That sound, that one word, was his anchor. It pulled him back from the abyss of his grief. He was no longer just the man who had lost Sarah. He was the man Lily and Rose called Pa. He fired his rifle, the muzzle flash momentarily illuminating the scene. Silas was lunging for the girls. Jack dropped the rifle and threw himself forward, tackling Silas in the dark. The fight was a brutal, desperate chaos of flailing limbs and grunted curses illuminated only by intermittent flashes of lightning from the storm outside. They rolled on the uneven ground, and their fists finding flesh, the roar of the wind, and the groaning of the mine, their only soundtrack. Sand poured in, making the floor treacherous, filling their eyes and mouths. Jack was stronger, but Silas was quicker, fueled by years of hatred. Silas managed to get a knife free, and its blade sliced across Jack's arm. Jack grunted in pain, but used the momentum to slam Silas's head against a rock. The knife clattered away into the darkness. Above them, a main support beam cracked with a sound like a gunshot. The mine was coming down. "Get out!" Jack yelled to the girls. "Go now!" He could hear them scrambling, untying their ropes and crawling toward the entrance. He had to keep Silas here. He had to end this. He found Silas's throat in the dark and squeezed. Silas thrashed beneath him, his fingers clawing at Jack's face. But Jack's grip was iron, fueled by 5 years of pain and a brand new ferocious need to protect his children. Just as Silas's struggles began to weaken, a massive timber splintered above and crashed down, pinning Silas's leg. He screamed a sound of pure agony that was swallowed by the storm. Jack rolled free, his body bruised and battered. Lightning flashed again, and he saw Silas, trapped, his face a mask of hate and terror. Jack's pistol was on the ground nearby. He picked it up. Here was his chance. Revenge. An eye for an eye. For Sarah. For the years of lies. For the terror he had put the girls through. His finger tightened on the trigger, and the cold steel a final, terrible comfort. He looked at Silas, writhing under the beam, and then toward the mouth of the cave, where he could just make out the silhouettes of Lily and Rose, waiting for him against the swirling curtain of sand. He saw their faces in his mind, and he saw Sarah's, not the despairing woman from Silas's story, but the smiling woman from the locket. What would she want? What would the man she loved do? His character, his soul hung in the balance of this single choice. Vengeance or mercy, the past or the future. With a ragged breath that tasted of sand and blood, he lowered the gun. Killing Silas would make him no better. It would only feed the cycle of violence that had cost him so much. It would make him the man Silas believed him to be. He turned his back on his trapped and defeated enemy and stumbled toward the light, toward his daughters. Just as Jack reached the mouth of the mine, a group of riders appeared through the blinding sand, materializing like phantoms. It was Sheriff Vance and a small posse. Vance must have followed him. Thorne, the sheriff, yelled over the howl of the wind. "He's in there." Jack shouted back, gesturing toward the dark mine entrance. "He's trapped and the mine's collapsing." He staggered forward and collapsed to his knees, pulling Lily and Rose into a desperate protective embrace. They clung to him, their small bodies trembling, their tears mixing with the rain and sand on his face. Sheriff Vance and his men, working quickly and efficiently against the collapsing tunnel, managed to drag the wounded and cursing Silas Blackwood from the mine just before the entrance gave way, completely sealing the monarch and its ghosts forever, with a deafening roar of falling rock and earth. They bound Silas's hands and hauled him onto a horse. As they led him away, his pale blue eyes, wild with pain and defeated rage, locked onto Jack's. But Jack felt nothing. The hatred that had consumed Silas had no hold on him anymore. He simply held his daughters tighter. The ride back to the ranch was slow and silent, the storm having exhausted its fury, leaving behind a world washed clean and eerily quiet. The town, alerted by the posse, was waiting. As they rode down the main street, people emerged from their homes and businesses. But this time their stares were not filled with suspicion or judgment. They were filled with a quiet, solemn respect. They had heard the truth from the sheriff of the vendetta, the kidnapping, the showdown. They saw not a reclusive outcast, but a father who had fought a monster to save his children. The midwife stepped forward and gently tended to the gash on Jack's arm, her touch firm and kind. Mr. Abernathy from the bank gave him a solemn nod, a gesture of shared understanding. Redemption, it seemed, was finally living up to its name. Back at the cabin, the silence was different. It wasn't empty. It was peaceful. Jack sat the girls down at the table, the familiar wood a comforting presence. He knew he had to tell them the truth, his truth, not the poisoned version Silas had used as a weapon. He looked at Lily, then at Rose, his heart aching with a love so fierce it almost frightened him. "There's something you need to know," he began, his voice low and heavy. "About my wife, Sarah, and about my past." He told them everything. He told them about the gunfight, about Daniel Blackwood, and about the lie he himself had believed for 5 years. He didn't spare himself, laying his guilt and his grief bare before them. And finally, his voice thick with emotion, he told them the hardest part, the devastating truth of how Sarah had really died. He expected them to be scared, to pull away from the darkness in his past. When he finished, the only sound was the gentle crackle of the fire. Lily, her eyes shining with an understanding far beyond her years, reached across the table and placed her small hand for his large bruised one. "That was before us," she said simply. Rose nodded, her expression serious. "You're not that man anymore." She added, her innocent wisdom cutting straight to the heart of it all. "You're our pa." Their acceptance was a balm on a wound he thought would never heal. It wasn't forgiveness, because they saw nothing to forgive. It was grace, pure and unconditional. In their eyes, he was not the sum of his past tragedies, but the man who had opened his door in a storm. He was their father. That was his redemption. Months passed. Spring gave way to a warm, golden summer. The ranch, once a silent monument to loss, was now filled with the sounds of life. The constant murmur of the girls' chatter, the squeak of a newly built swing hanging from the old oak tree, the echo of laughter carried on the prairie wind. The scars on Jack's arm and soul began to fade, replaced by the daily rhythms of a life he never thought he'd have. The town had embraced them. The whispers had been replaced by friendly greetings. The midwife brought them fresh bread every week. Sheriff Vance would stop by just to share a cup of coffee on the porch. Jack Thorne, the recluse, was gone. In his place was a father, a neighbor, a man who had found his way back from the wilderness. One evening, as twilight settled over the plains in a soft blanket of purple and gold, Jack sat on the porch step, watching the girls chase fireflies in the tall grass. Sheriff Vance had returned his locket, recovered from Silas's belongings. He held it in his palm, the silver warm from his touch. For the first time, he could look at the tiny, smiling portrait of Sarah without being overwhelmed by the pain of her loss. He felt sorrow, yes, but it was a gentle, quiet ache, not a gaping wound. He knew now that the greatest way to honor her memory was not to live in the shadow of her death, but to embrace the life that had been given back to him. He went inside the cabin and knelt before the cedar chest he had built for the girls. It was no longer empty. It was filled with their small, precious treasures: Rose's wooden bird, a collection of smooth river stones, a bright blue ribbon Lily had won at the town fair, drawings of their new family, a large bearded man with two small figures holding his hands. With a steady hand, Jack opened the silver locket one last time, his thumb gently tracing Sarah's face. He whispered a silent goodbye, not to her memory, but to the grief that had defined him for so long. Then he closed it and placed it gently inside the cedar chest nestled among the girls' keepsakes. He was merging his past with his future, creating a new story, a new history for this family, forged not by blood, but by choice. He closed the lid. He was no longer a ghost haunted by the past. He was a man with a future, a home, filled with warmth and laughter, and two daughters who had, in saving him, taught him how to live again. He had ridden into redemption, seeking supplies, and had found a family. He had faced down a man bent on revenge and had found his own peace. He had found not just redemption, but a new reason to live.